I've had my fair share of disasters when it comes to introducing new players to D&D, and I think we all have, because it's a really tricky game. Now, looking back, there's quite a few things that I've changed that I currently do, and quite a few things that I avoid now. So, I really want to kind of dive into what I've discarded from my past adventures, and what I kind of do now to try to set up these players for a successful first session. A lot of people may not understand this, but there's one thing that I do that I don't think many other DMs do. I really don't give my players the player's handbook to start that first session. Because, let's be honest, other than me, who's gonna really sit down and read 320 pages, let alone remember all of that? I know for me, it took nearly 2 years before it really sunk in, and even then, I didn't know all the ins and outs until I became a DM. So I think it's kind of one of these unfair expectations that we as veteran players hold on to, or at least I did, where I kind of felt like my players should know all the base rules. Now I've kind of moved into this philosophy where I kind of coach them and help them build up their characters based on what they want to play, and for the most part I kind of try to stay out of the rules and let them learn through making mistakes, through playing the games, and introduce mechanics as they come up. For me, I feel like it just helps cut down on that overwhelming barrier that there is when you start off a game that has really 5 books necessary to understand what's going on, and each one of them is at least 200 pages. It's just a lot to expect of a new player, in my opinion. While we're all very invested in our own plans, and organization is key to having success in D&D, I don't think that that's something that should always be planned on. I know personally I've had players where we've sat down and had 3 hours of a session and somebody spent a good third of that time sifting through their old notes. And with new players, I find that that's just exaggerated. These players need more time to find notes because whether it's combat, a puzzle, or an interaction, sometimes you just don't remember what you need to, and you have to dig back in those notes. Now, if you're doing notes and the player's handbook and all these other things and you're not utilizing any tools for organization because you're new to the game, that can take a lot of time. So one thing I've kind of learned to incorporate into my games is I actually plan to give my players breaks, step up, get food, go watch a show or something. I don't really know, but it's different for every group. Some of my groups will stop and we'll have dinner, and that gives players the time they need to process the information and find what they may have kind of misorganized. Or to be honest, sometimes I make these breaks for myself as a DM because I can forget where I was going with a puzzle, especially if I'm trying to find a place to give them a hint. That can be really challenging because I don't want to spoil the whole puzzle, but I also kind of need to help them if I want the encounter to keep going. So these are kind of things to think about. Planning for delays is usually a good tactic anyways, but in a session where you're introducing a new player, you have to recognize that it's going to take them a long time to remember things, especially spells for spellcasters and combat abilities for melees. Sometimes they may need to sit down and reread that. So how can you fill that time? What kind of dialogue can you put in there, and how can you plan for that? Personally, I think it's better to overwrite dialogue and plan fun things for your players to do outside of the game to give breaks for players to refresh themselves. Now here's the one that probably took me the most time to wrap my head around. Especially as a new DM, it's not something easy to do, to just not expect anything from your players. These people are new to the game. I mean, who am I to expect them to remember things like I've mentioned before? But more than that, who am I to expect that they will enjoy the game? I mean, yeah, I'm going to do everything possible to make sure they have fun, but if they're not having fun, that's not their fault. This is something that's a new experience and they're being brave enough to try it. So one thing that I try to kind of encourage new DMs to do is avoid planning for somebody and expecting somebody to love the game right away, especially as you do, because we've been playing this game for at least a few years, most of us when we start DMing, and some of us this is our first encounter, but we've gotten so enthralled in this fantasy world that we really wanted to build for ourselves, And I think it's just really key that we kind of keep those expectations low, because if we have too high of a bar for them to meet, they're not going to have fun in that session, and that might actually drive your friends away from playing the game.
Our job is to have zero expectations and just let go.
And personally, I want to get as many of my friends into this game as I can so that we can all have sessions together. Building a D&D binder may very well be the most underrated thing in this entire hobby, which is crazy to me because D&D inherently is a very creative game and people love to customize things. I mean, I'm not saying you have to go overboard like some of those really special school binders that you would see people bringing into high school where they're like custom painted and whatnot, but you also can do that. And so a thing I do with all my new players is I sit down and I set up a really basic binder with them. And this is probably also one of the cheapest things that I bring to my table. I mean, it can cost as little as a pack of pens. Now, why do I think it's such a big deal? Well, it really helps with organizing. If they're playing a spellcaster, you can just use trading card slots, and if you have the spell cards that D&D makes, you can actually kind of slot in those spells so they have quick notes to reference, but also you can keep their character sheets in there, their notes. Everything's in one place so that it's easier for them to remember to bring to your session. And when you keep all of that in one spot, in those like really nice plastic sleeves that I'm sure you've had at least one teacher ask you to use at one point, you can even write on it with dry erase, which can be great for tracking health and other things that aren't permanent. And personally, I like it better than writing on paper, because then I'm not constantly writing and erasing and eventually having to replace my sheet because it's turned gray from how many times I've written on it and erased it with a number 2 pencil. I think it's a little bit better of a way to keep everything in one spot, and also to kind of change the sheets without having to go fully online, because I'm a big pen and paper guy personally, and when I try to put D&D on a tablet, I end up spending more time trying to switch between files to find what I need, or scrolling through 20 pages of a Word document, versus just flipping open a binder with tabs in it. While I do too love to plot, sometimes it's not the best thing for new players. See, when you're introducing new players and you're having a campaign that is made up mostly of new players, let's say everyone at the table's brand new, or 1 to 2 people are veterans and the other party of 6 are all new players, you have this really kind of weird ground that you have to kind of follow, because you're trying not to overwhelm them with game rules, but you're also trying to give them an interesting enough story where they're engaged. And for me, I've kind of found that I actually have to tone back my plots quite a bit. And sometimes I've even gone back to the base books depending on what people find interesting. Sometimes new players and veterans alike can find it a refreshing change of pace just to sit down and run through a basic adventure hunting monsters Legolas style. It's a great time. So this is one of those things where it's like, yes, I add in more aggressive plots and plot twists that are 22 sessions deep, but I let my players get a grasp first because there's so much to remember already in the game. I mean, combat, let's talk about how many pages in the handbook are dedicated to it. I mean, it's almost a quarter of the book. That's a lot to remember, so with that, I really don't want to overwhelm them with my personal plans. Now, as my sessions go on, I tend to toss some memento moments back, start getting them used to these plot twists, these different intricate thoughts as time goes on, and then I jump into that. Now, making a session accessible is probably the most important thing for adding a new player. I talked about this before with my expectations, but you can't expect everybody to love this game, so a big thing that I'll do is, when I'm starting a campaign for new players, I'll build it in a setting and in a way where people can leave and come back freely. If I have 12 friends who want to learn the game, and I only have room for a party of 6, and I want to have 2 veterans in there to kind of help coach them on roleplay and kind of get them interacting, what I'll do oftentimes is I'll make kind of something where they're interacting in a town, a tavern, an adventurer's guild that has kind of an open community where people can ebb and flow as they wish. And then if somebody can't make it to a session, you can slot in one of those other new players and you can kind of rotate through people and make sure that everyone is able to be there. Maybe let's say you have a friend who can only play once a month or once every other week and you're running a session weekly, then you can simply just move people in and out. You can have them interact with other people in the world and other parties in the world because, let's be honest, you don't interact with the same people every single day, or if you do, every once in a while somebody new might pop into your life. It makes the game realistic and also gives you the ability as the DM to introduce more people to the game without it being such a steep demand from them or you. So this is kind of one of those win-win situations where you're making your life easier and theirs. So maybe think about, for your session, setting aside one session just to teach new players, and how maybe you can introduce multiple people to the game and make it less of a time commitment for everyone. Now, of course, all of this is from my own experience introducing new players, and everybody's mileage kind of varies at their table. Your friend group is going to be very different than mine, but I think that these are things that have worked for me and would really benefit other people if they tried to implement them into their games. Now, feel free to use any of the ideas from this video, and if you have any of your own or tips that you think are great for introducing new players, please leave them in the comment, because I would like to expand my own methods, and maybe I'll even mention them in one of my future videos so that we can kind of all learn together. Now, I am trying to hit 2,000 subscribers before the end of this year. I know it's really late, but if you got value out of this video and you're willing to subscribe, I would really appreciate it and would help us make that goal. Alright guys, remember to stay inspired.